Hi, and welcome to Higher Comprehension with Jason and Chris. And today we have a special guest, AJ Morgan. Welcome to the show, AJ.
Hello.
This week we're going to be talking about the history of wrestling. And one of the reasons we ask AJ to join us is because he is a professional wrestler. Would you like to talk about the history of wrestling a little bit?
Absolutely.
What you got?
You wanted to start early, or back to when wrestling was first put into a predetermined side?
I would have to say we'd start from the beginning, 704 BC, when wrestling first became a part of the Greek Olympics and had its first written rules.
That's a little out of my comfort zone because that's more Greco-Roman wrestling. If you know anything on that, you can go for it.
Well, yes, it was, but wrestling. Uh, geez, I bet the first two brothers wrestled. As far as it goes, wrestling probably goes back as far as there was brothers, or two guys just trying to test their strength. But when Angkor Wat in Cambodia, very ancient site, at least 7 centuries old. They have depictions of people wrestling. The Mongolians had a famous wrestling. Japanese have sumo wrestling. The Greeks and the Romans, even the Sumerians, who are what we consider the cradle of civilization and the oldest writings. They had depictions of people wrestling, and so did the Egyptians. And some of the hieroglyphics and stuff, they would have depictions of people in wrestling holds. Native Americans wrestled.
Hmm?
Wrestling goes back, I think, as far as, like I said, as far as mankind goes back. I think there was always people wrestling. But um, as far as like organized wrestling, where would you say that started? Outside of the Greek Olympics,
Um,
more
bef-
modern day.
More modern day, that'd be about the 30s, the early 1900s, and with people like Ed Stringer Lewis and guys like that who could really hold their own in any kind of fight, started to try to make it a little more entertaining by not physically hurting each other, but trying to put on a show. That introduced the Gold Dust Trio, being Joseph Mond, Martin Farmer Burns, and Ed Stringer Lewis all got together with a promoter named Billy Sandow and his brother Strongman Eugene Sandow. Um, all came together to make a less real fight, but was more entertaining to the crowd. And as we can see, considering it's how we run now, the crowd picked up to it and loved it.
Oh yeah, well, any kind of combat sport or competition like that, people have been drawn to throughout history. The Romans built colosseums everywhere they went so that they could put on the gladiatorial matches and uh, things of that nature. I mean, when you talk about the history of wrestling, it's really the history of fighting in some cases because it was a show.
Hmm?
At the Coliseum. The Romans were putting on a show. It's a misnomer that you know most of the gladiators died. 75% of them lived. They were the rock stars of their day. They were popular. People had their favorite gladiators that they would go and watch. It was more of a rare occasion when one died. There was a lot of injuries and things like that, but they went through a lot of training in order to stay alive, just like wrestlers do now. They train and train and train in order to not get hurt, or MMA fighters, they train to get better and in order to not get hurt, you
Yeah,
know.
I think MMA's a bit better of an analogy for like the Coliseum because we're training how to work together to keep each other safe. In MMA, you're having to
Right.
go out there, even boxing, you're going out there having to find ways to keep yourself safe while
True.
still being able to
True.
win.
Very true. But me liking history, I want to cover all of it. The wrestling was gone out of the Olympics for a long time, and it wasn't re-included in the first modern Olympics until 1896, and it's been a part of the Summer Olympics ever since 1904. And the what I find interesting about the Greco-Roman was it forbidden holds from the waist down. You know, in the Olympics, you couldn't have any. It was all just waist up.
Hmm.
And then the original Greek Olympics, you know, they'd start out wearing some skin tight clothes, but they ended up completely nude. I think we talked about this in the failed attempt of our prior video where we had technical difficulties.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, originally the Greco-Roman wrestlers would wrestle in the nude. Can't imagine, you know, why they would want to do that, but whatever. But, you know, in the 1800s, most European capital cities would host wrestling tournaments and give prize money, you know, to the winners. And they were much more violent in the early years. And,
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, the matches lasted a lot longer. They could go on for like 2 or 3 hours.
Some have even been recorded as going on for 2 or 3 days.
Well, I was going to say in the 1912 Olympics, a match between Martin Klein of Russia, it was Estonia now, and Alfred Akinsanya of Finland lasted 11 hours and 41 minutes before Klein finally won. Klein was so tired he didn't even bother to compete for the gold medal the next day. He just took the silver. He was too wore out from wrestling for nearly 12 hours that it's just like, you know, screw it. You can have it.
Yeah, 100%. I don't disagree with him either.
No, me either. I mean, that's ridiculous. They should have gave him a week to rest up after that shit.
Absolutely.
Language, but you know, that's ridiculous. But we mentioned, or I mentioned that, you know, they would wrestle in the nude. The word gymnasium means the place where you go nude. Is the literal translation of it. I just had to throw that out there for the sake of it. But anyway, so you know, you were talking about like in the 30s is where professional wrestling really took off, and then you get up into the 40s and 50s, and then you have
was it Verne Gagne?
Yeah, there you go.
AWA.
Yep. Would you like to talk about what he did a little bit, Verne Gagne?
Verne is a very interesting case because if you actually go back and watch AWA wrestling, the wrestling's not very good. But Verne has trained either, you know, directly or indirectly through the people he's trained, just about every person who's ever been popular in wrestling. His roots even branched down to me because someone who taught Verne taught somebody else that ended up helping teach the guy who's teaching me. Verne has his
Josh?
Yeah, Verne has his fingerprints in everything. Wild. I mean, I'm probably 7, 8 generations away from Verne, but someone who has taught him, who has taught somebody else, who has taught somebody else, who's taught somebody else, has given something to Josh. Probably more than one.
Yeah, I knew that he had trained so many champs and WWE Hall of Famers, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, Kurt Hennig, the Iron Sheik, Sergeant Slaughter, Ken Patera, who's interesting, Paul Ellering, Buddy Rich, Buddy Rose, Wild Bill Irwin, Ric Flair, and of course his son, Greg Gagne.
Oh, God, the worst wrestler ever.
Yeah, but you know, he went through a lot. But he also trained Jim Brunzell, who was a champion high jumper. And I mentioned Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. He was a state champion wrestler. I think those are, you know, interesting facts.
A lot of professional wrestlers usually start in some kind of collegiate wrestling of some sort. It's easy transition.
Yeah, I can say that for a lot of them.
Yeah, just about everything is the same other than the fact that you aren't trying to hurt somebody.
And didn't Hulk Hogan start out with AWA?
He did not start out with the AWA, but he got his most big before WWF with AWA. He had left Vince after the whole Rocky thing.
Yep. Yeah. 1981, Hogan went from the WWF to the AWA because Vince Sr. was mad Hogan played in the Rocky movie. Yeah.
And then when Vince Jr. took over and was purging everywhere of their talent, he went back to Hulk Hogan.
Right.
So, I mean, you can even say that if Verne Gagne wasn't around, there might not be a Hulkamania.
Right. And, in the early 80s, the AWA had all the best people. And, then Vince Jr. comes along in 83 and he starts collecting all of them. I don't know if he had that plan from the beginning or what, but before we get to that, let's talk about the Hart Foundation. Didn't even mention them. What's the father's name? I forget.
Stu Hart.
Stu Hart. Yeah, I always forget his name for some reason. But every one of his sons, all of his daughters were married to wrestlers. All of his kids were wrestlers. I mean, the dungeon's what they called it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. The basement of the Hart house. But a lot of wrestlers were trained there as well.
There's in the same way Verne Gagne kind of had his fingers in every American wrestling. Any wrestler from Canada, even today, Stu Hart has his fingerprints into. Brian Pillman and Chris Benoit. I'm trying to think of more that aren't related to the Harts. Even British Bulldog and Dynamite Kid, because of Bulldog's connection to the Hart Foundation.
Yep. As I said, either his daughters were all married to wrestlers and his sons were all wrestlers. I mean, every one of his kids had some kind of something to do with the business.
And all of them were successful in Stampede Wrestling. I could never imagine why.
Would you like to talk about Jim Crockett Promotions for a minute?
Sure. Jim Crockett is what led into WCW.
Right.
Sorry, I didn't have my notes ready on Jim Crockett.
It was founded in 1931 and was one of the cornerstone of the National Wrestling Alliance. By the 80s, Jim Crockett Promotions and the WWF were the two largest promotions in the U.S. Crockett Jr. sold to Ted Turner in 88, and that's when it became WCW.
Along with WCW was not just Jim Crockett Promotions either. WCW was a amalgamation of a couple different promotions, just like how WWE is now, where they have pretty much any territory that existed before them is now a part of them.
Right, because they bought most of them up.
Jim Crockett actually ran an event not too long ago under their JCP organization, and it was Ric Flair's last match.
Oh, really? That's
interesting. The dude who ran the event is Rick's son-in-law, and had gotten with David Crockett to use the JCP name to host Ric Flair's last match.
That's interesting. What about Smoky Mountain Wrestling? Well, we're still talking about the territories. You want to talk about that one?
Yeah, that would be the last of the territory system because he was in it at the very end. Smoky Mountain was run by Jim Cornette, one of the most prolific wrestling figures in the entire world.
Probably the most hated man in wrestling, but yeah, it didn't shut down until December of 95.
And it was bought out by WWE. He had ran with WCW with the Midnight for a long time and finally got fed up with Ole Anderson and Jim Herd and just the way wrestling was going in a more corporate way. So he went to make the last of the dying territory, Smoky Mountain Wrestling, and it produced gobs of talent that nobody would have expected being good, like Al Snow, who's now running the OVW Academy, Chris Jericho, Lance Storm, Ricky Morton had a really good final run there with Robert Gibson. Stan Lane and Dennis Condrey were both part of Smoky Mountain Wrestling. They were both part of the Midnight Express.
I was about to say the Midnight Express and the Rock and Roll Express. Those two I have a lot of memories of.
They also started, in America at least, Kane, Glenn Jacobs.
Oh, okay.
Smoky Mountain Wrestling hosted the first ever Undertaker versus Glenn Jacobs match. That is what got Kane signed.
I told you the main event for the wrestling match that your mother and I attended was Kane and Batista. It was the first time I'd ever seen Batista.
And now you can't go anywhere without seeing him.
That was like 04 or 05.
05 sounds about right. That's when he hit his big singles
run. I think it
run.
was 05, yeah. You were like 2.
Anyway. That's when he still had that shitty goatee down the middle of his chin.
Right. Okay, so anyway, that brings us to like the end of the territories and what pretty much killed.
Before we hit the end of the territories, there is one other person that I want to be mentioned because we've talked about this. Female promoters in the territory system, there were 2.
And we should actually, definitely talk about those. Let's speak about both of those.
I don't have very much information on one of them just because, in the nicest way possible, a lot of the information on her is questionable at best. But one of my favorite places to go back and watch and go back and listen to about is Classic Memphis Wrestling, ran by Christine Jarrett, the mother of Jerry Jarrett and grandmother of Jeff Jarrett.
Right.
She
had quite a run there.
Oh, God.
As champion.
Christine Jarrett was the actual first female wrestling promoter in history. And she was...
As opposed to The Rock's grandmother.
Yeah. I'm not saying she didn't do good. She took a company from her late husband, knew nothing about wrestling more than what she told him, and ran with it. That's impressive.
And she made it work,
Absolutely. I take no credit away from her, except for the fact that she is not the first female wrestling promoter. That is Christine Jarrett.
Right.
And she was hired in the late 40s by Nick Goulas, a big wrestling name in the territory days, to sell tickets for his wrestling show, and ended up getting so good at it that she started her own promotion and actually employed the mother of Jim Cornette, which is how Jim Cornette got his way into the business.
Well, one more thing. Well, since you mentioned Jim Cornette, I've got to mention this. I've watched Tales of the Territories and Dark Side of the Ring and things like that. And the story of Jim Cornette's mother hiring a bodyguard to protect him was the funniest damn thing I ever heard. But that man got more heat than any wrestler or manager or anybody that I can remember or ever think of.
Do you remember who the manager, or not the manager, the bodyguard was?
I can see him, but I can't remember his name.
It's Ray Traylor. He was Big Bubba Rogers then, but he was best known as the Big Boss Man.
It was Big Boss Man?
It was Big Boss Man.
He looked a lot different in a suit. I didn't realize that was him.
Very much. There's actually a great story Cornette's told. One of the things that they were building Boss Man for was that he couldn't feel pain. So if someone smacked him with a steel chair, he would stand there, turn at him and go, "What the fuck was that?"
Show no emotion, yeah.
But they were going to a show, checking into a hotel. Of course, Boss Man and Cornette are riding together. Cornette gets out of the car. Boss Man gets out of the car. Cornette goes to the trunk to go get their stuff, and the dude who was driving the car shut Boss Man's hands in the car. This is at a time when kayfabe, which is the barrier between showing wrestling's real and showing the real side of wrestling.
Right, and they were supposed to maintain that no matter what back in the day.
Absolutely. And the man who's not supposed to feel pain had his fingers shut in a car door.
And I've had that happen. Speaking from personal experience, it fucking hurts.
Yeah, same. I've had the same thing happen. It hurts, and he no-sold it. Until they walked in the building, they open the door, Cornette shuts the door, and he just screams like the smallest 5-year-old girl you could ever imagine. Just, ow, fuck!
I imagine your brother screaming when he was a kid and me putting on the Frankenstein mask.
That's about exactly what happened.
Like a little girl.
And just the commitment that man had to the wrestling business is the way a lot of people back then felt, and it's something I wish more people gave a shit about now.
Right.
We can. It's the same as I wouldn't want Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible to look at the camera and go, "I did my own stunts. That was cool, wasn't it?"
Exactly. Okay, so we come to the end of the territories. Basically, Vince Jr. starts buying up all the major talent from all the different territories,
Hmm?
and he pretty much put them all out of business. Uh,
Oh no,
as
he
a
put them all
bus-
out of business and then bought them all out.
yeah, exactly. And from what I hear, he never even paid Stu Hart a dime, even
Nope.
though technically he bought them out.
He had got the rights to him and had never paid him any money, and then the kind of, well, I'm not going to get any money out of it, so make me a promise. You'll employ my sons. That went
And
well.
for Brett, not so much for Owen.
No, so the only two
Well,
that
not so much for Brett either. He's became infamous for the Montreal screw job.
Stu Hart never saw a dime. His one promise was employ my sons. Keith, Bruce, and the other one I can't remember the name of all got fired after a year. Jim Neidhart kind of just fizzled out and got fired
Yep.
because he was on drugs at the time.
He was
Owen Hart,
son-in-law, right? He was married to one of
yes,
the daughters.
yes.
Yes.
Owen Hart died, and
Yeah.
Bret Hart got
Tragically died.
gruesome. And Bret Hart got screwed out of his belt, fired, went to another company, and then got a concussion that ended his career.
Goldberg?
Yep.
Yeah, I remember that. Or
They're
something about that.
they're right in second place behind most tragic family dynasty in wrestling, right behind the Von
Behind
Erichs.
the Von Erichs. There's nothing more tragic than what happened to the Von
They're
Erichs.
3 out of 5 of his sons died before he did. That's horrible.
Yeah. And we really should touch on the Von Erichs. I mean, I remember watching Kerry when I was a kid. He was one of the first wrestlers that I can really recall whose name I remembered, you know. Other than that, I think the next one I remember is Adrian Street. And the only reason I remember him is because of his whole gay, almost drag queen type thing going on. I don't know what the gimmick was. It was some kind of gay thing, but I
It
remember him
was
just
gay
because he was so
flamboyance.
outrageous. And then, of course, Andre the Giant, who can. We can't even talk about wrestling without mentioning Andre the Giant.
Absolutely.
He was just such a tremendous thing, and they played him smart. You know, they instead of leaving him in one place because he was there in the territory days, they would move him around from territory to territory, so the novelty of his size didn't wear off.
That, and they used him as a bargaining chip because he was technically loyal to Vince Sr. So if Vince Sr., we're talking about the Von Erichs, if he wanted Waldo Von Erich to make his MSG show, instead of just taking all the talent like his son did, he would actually offer things like Andre. Like, if you give me Waldo for my MSG show, I'll give you Andre for 2 months.
Right.
And
And
that's
I've
how you keep him
also
fresh.
heard that for the time, he was the highest paid wrestler of his era.
Absolutely, because he was traveling all over the United States, all through Japan, all through Britain, anywhere that had wrestling in a big scene, he was there.
And he also played a tremendous part in the Princess Diary.
Princess Bride.
Oh, the Princess Bride. That's right.
He
I
was
loved him in that. He was so
the
funny. Fez.
he was the first wrestler to break mainstream and to go into movies.
Yeah, and I loved the role he played. It was just so good for him. It was perfect.
Goofy big guy. That's exactly what he was.
Yeah, biggest guy you're likely to run into.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but anyway, so Vince bought up all the talent, destroyed the territories. Um, a few decent, ones have popped up since then. You get TNA and
Ring of Honor.
Ring of Honor. What is it? Japan.
New Japan.
New Japan. That's what it is. I couldn't remember the name of it. But there's still several of them around. AEW.
Uh,
There are several that are still going, but I think he really hurt wrestling overall by doing that. But
I
as
don't.
a business move, I think it was brilliant.
I don't think
It
he
made him a
hurt.
billionaire. Come on, who can argue with that?
I don't think he hurt wrestling so much that he hurt the wrestling companies around him that had been, his pioneers. He
Right.
he did help usher in a new era of wrestling to where we are in our modern times, but he stepped on everybody that came before him.
I'd like to thank Alex for joining us, or AJ Morgan, if you're a wrestling fan.
The professional!
And we thank everybody for listening and for tuning in to Higher Comprehension. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.